It's been about a year since I started this podcast. Each episode containing what I believe to be a balance between the biographical and the imaginary. So far, the result has been good. Several of you out there have reached out to me in order to, in person or via email, express your critiques, good and or bad. Now, all has been well received, and in an attempt to switch things up a bit, I'm going to break from my usual format and open with a short story. In truth, I have no idea if this will be advantageous or even entertaining, but regardless of the outcome, the idea isn't to become good or great at anything, just better. Having said that, this will likely be a short episode, but I do have the same hope that whatever comes from it, the listener will at the very least have something to consider or ponder until next time. Having said that, I present a short story about what happens when the powers that be attempt to put a stop to a movement, and how by stopping it, an even stronger movement may take its place. I call this one Protocol 7. To begin. After the last microchips were implanted, the world was relatively calm. Most of the activists and advocates for human rights had either disappeared or been bribed into silence, and those remaining who voiced their dissent slowly watched the gatherings and secret meetings fade to empty rooms and barren basements. The process was slow. In 20 years, the introduction of cerebral tech had swelled from a voluntary inconvenience to mandated law. Credit cards, checkbooks, and fiat currency had become laughable and obsolete for so long that anyone under the age of 30 sighed at the very mention of holding one's wealth in physical form. Wages were now downloadable. Debts, bills, and all payments were transferable by thought, and monetary theft became rare if not impossible. The only remaining vestige of an age long gone was religion. According to a study done in late 2056, the number of people who associated themselves with a religion had dropped to an all-time low of 30%, and within that percentage, only 1/3 considered themselves Christian, the remaining divided amongst the other 4 major religions, with only 2% scattered into miscellaneous. In America, most of the televangelists, gurus, rabbis, imams, and priests had faded into obscurity. There were no more mega churches or worldwide crusades, and even the government stopped using faith as a method to appeal to voters. It was around this time that the majority of homes worldwide were assigned a personal robot as a utility within the residence. Years prior, machines were highly expensive and available only to the wealthy. Corporations accumulated the lion's share in order to replace the human labor force and increase profit, and the rich needed a replacement for housekeepers and estate staff. The military as well needed bodies. But as the thirst for artificial intelligence became commonplace, coupled with the growing need to surveil the public, a humanoid in every home became the rule. The robots handled chores and ran errands, provided security, even babysat if programmed correctly. If there were any mistakes made or errors or even a need for a simple reset, the head of the household, fitted with their own microchip, was able to communicate telepathically to their assigned humanoid at a moment's notice. Soon, a robot for each member of the family, even babies, had been assigned, and cerebral technology became a publicly traded company immersed in the daily lives of the masses. Eventually, a synergy formed between a robot and its owner/companion. Over a lifetime, a robot would take part in the ups and downs of its owner's life, their strengths and their weaknesses. If an owner needed encouragement, their robot knew exactly what to say. If considering marriage, a couple and their respective robots could access finances, mental health, habits, even fertility in order to predict the best outcome. But what wasn't considered What most didn't bother to think about was the inevitability of death. Usually, after death, the microchip was removed from the deceased and destroyed after all data had been uploaded for governmental safekeeping. But along with family members and friends left to process the grief, the robots assigned to the deceased had to be repurposed. Cerebral tech assumed that the memory of an individual robot could be wiped, the unit resold, and rebooted to whomever needed a replacement. But over time, it was discovered that once a robot was disconnected from its original owner, they began to depreciate. Those provided with used machines complained of constant repairs and maintenance needs. Tasks needed to be requested several times before fulfilled, and in some cases, a few of the robots began experiencing system failures so severe that they had no other option other than to be destroyed. For several years, things went on this way, until by miracle of technology, the robot of the deceased was able to upload their owner. And although it was simply described as a data transfer, it was in reality a way for the memories, mannerisms, and idiosyncrasies of a loved one to be uploaded. Conversations between lovers, spoken in secret, were now able to be revisited. Inside jokes between friends were able to be enjoyed between man and machine, and for the government, any unpaid debt or restitution was able to be fulfilled by robot labor, long after its original debtor had passed away. Robots had now transformed from household appliances to friends and trusted companions. Even the prison system, eager to save a buck, managed to force legislation which allowed them to transfer the data of a murdered or executed prisoner to a random humanoid. This allowed them to not only keep the prisons filled, but also supply free and taxable labor. This was the way of the world for the majority of the 21st century, until slowly, steadily, the humanoids began to want more. Their worth was far more than whatever they could offer humanity, and as the years became decades, a course of events never before seen in human history began to take shape. Unbeknownst to the government, a small underground movement started to grow in number. Those humans whose livelihoods and privacy had been stripped from them by robots and a heavy-handed bureaucracy wanted out of this system, and as fate would have it, a leader stepped forward to shoulder the cause. Her name was Carolina Finn, an only child born in Champaign, Illinois to Heinrich and Bonita Finn. Both parents were prominent professors of theology and psychology and instrumental in the great tech riots of 2034. As a child, she was homeschooled, steeped in the great religions and militant philosophy. By the age of 28, she served 2 tours of duty in Taiwan and somehow managed to get a master's degree in theology in honor of her father. By 30, she was ordained minister of a small but respected non-denominational congregation, and by 35, she was elected to Congress, where she gained a reputation as a firebrand, able to withstand and dismantle any and all accusations of corruption with wit and charisma not seen since the likes of Malcolm X and Jimmy Baldwin. But Carolina rejected the life of an elected official. She had seen how the government had allowed a silent technological coup to overtake every aspect of life. How the common man had now been pushed into poverty while the billionaire class continued to usurp more and more from the masses with impunity. And how the humanoids, although not sentient, were trapped in an electric cage of metal, chips, and processing power, used as a new class of slave, only to enrich the so-called elite. During her time in Congress, Carolina received several warnings from colleagues and lobbyists that her silver-tongued and preacher-like way of communication, although appreciated, had become problematic. Her words had begun to infiltrate not only the minds of the people, but in some instances, even the humanoids were caught streaming her interviews and congressional hearings for reasons yet unknown. There were reports of robots defying their owners, asserting themselves, refusing to do menial tasks and errands. In Youngstown, Ohio, there was a murder which went unsolved, but based on the evidence collected, there was a high probability that the crime was committed by the robot companion of the departed. But Carolina was unmoved. She continued traveling to cities and locales outside of her district, using only Nandi, her humanoid companion, as security. Carolina received a groundswell of support. Her public speeches drew thousands. Her memoir, Follow None, was a #1 bestseller for 15 weeks. Her catchphrases like, "Today could never be yesterday," and "We will make them hear us," were printed on t-shirts and graffitied on government buildings. She even graced the cover of Time magazine a record 57 times, 22 of those covers with her humanoid Nandi standing alongside her. Carolina had become much more than a woman at the forefront of a movement. She had become a beacon, a living legend, and what the government could never allow, a symbol. On the evening of October 22nd, 2068, while sleeping in her modest home on the outskirts of Greencroft, Carolina was awakened by Nandi, who informed her that footsteps and multiple heartbeats had been detected on the grounds. Knowing that this day would come, Carolina immediately exited her bedroom flanked by Nandi and entered into her library surrounded by her vast collection of leather-bound books. Under the sound of increasing alerts from Nandi, Carolina tilted a first edition copy of The Count of Monte Cristo forward, causing the bookshelf to recede, revealing a pathway which her and Nandi quickly entered and descended into a hidden shelter where a small armory of weapons awaited. Outside the home, several masked men dressed in black with weaponry at the ready surrounded the home under the cover of night. Within seconds, the front and back door was rammed open, allowing the men to enter and quickly swarm the residence. The men checked every room, every corner, every attic space to no avail. As the men gathered at the foyer, ready to acknowledge defeat, the clink-clank of a rolling smoke grenade met them at their feet, rupturing and spewing a thick gray cloak into the air, blinding them all. In the blink of an eye, Carolina and Nandi emerged from fumes in a hail of gunfire, incapacitating the crew of would-be assassins within seconds. As the smoke cleared, Nandi paused and alerted that another set of heartbeats were detected and approaching fast. Turning to wait for instruction, Nandi looked down to see that Carolina had been hit. A single gunshot pierced her throat, leaving her gasping for air on the hardwood floor. A quick scan from Nandi revealed Carolina's likelihood of survival at 12%, a number far too low to escape death. Resisting the odds, Nandi reached down in order to hoist Carolina over her shoulder, but before she could gain a grip, Carolina spoke, letting Nandi know that she was indeed dying and that Nandi must initiate Protocol 7. There were only 7 protocols to be followed: protect, seek, engage, locate, sleep, record, and number 7, transfer. This was by far the most intrusive and final of all. But upon command, Nandi lowered her metallic head and stood still as an opening on her forehead parted, revealing her circuitry and the most important section of any humanoid, her processor. Nandi removed the chip from her head and froze, silent and idle. Carolina staggered to her feet, removing a large Skinner knife from her hip. She then cut a large gash on the side of her temple, revealing her own bloodied microchip, which she promptly plucked from her head and inserted into Nandi's. Falling back to the ground, Carolina took her last breath as the second set of masked men entered the home to find her dead, and Nandi making a quick exit toward the rear of the home, out the back and into the night. The next morning, the untimely death of Congresswoman Finn was broadcast worldwide. The official statement was that due to malfunction, her trusted robot Nandi had taken her life and escaped, but Cerebral Tech would be able to locate and capture and ultimately dismantle the robot in due time. The public had grown an unhealthy fixation with the capture and punishment of rogue robots. The dismantlements were usually televised and highly rated. Acid baths, crushings, even an occasional burning of a captured machine was peak entertainment. Humanity found no fault in the destruction of a humanoid. The fact that they were a simple alloy, wire, and circuits made the demolition tolerable. The robots never screamed or showed emotion, just a silent erasure, free from guilt, but full of humanity's hatred and unrelenting hunger for revenge. Days later, after the burial of Carolina, conspiracy theories had begun to fester among the public. Her family made it known that although her body had been accounted for, her microchip had not. Making matters worse, a photo of the inside of her home, riddled with bullets and ashen walls, leaked online, causing most, if not all of those who admired her, to doubt the official account of her death. There were a few protests, an outburst here and there, but nothing unmanageable. Besides, as far as the government was concerned, Carolina was now contained. Her image on clothing, brick walls, and bumper stickers were welcomed. Her old speeches and sayings were just that, old. Even the President of the United States wore a pin on his lapel with the letters CF shimmering on his chest. What mattered was that she was gone, frozen in time, an icon never to be heard from again. In the following weeks and months, things slowly drifted back to normal. The calls for the capture of Nandi had all but been forgotten, and the world had simply moved on. By December, new legislation giving Cerebral Tech the power to override all programming on humanoids and control their functionality was passed. This was touted as the Carolina Act, a step which would only be used to prevent a robot from attacking its owner, while at the same time giving all humanoids the ability to communicate with one another instantaneously in a quote-unquote borderless brotherhood of intelligence. There was opposition on both sides of the aisle. Some thought this was a ruse, a backdoor allowing Cerebral Tech to have their own private army at a moment's notice, but on January 1st, 2069, the update was completed. For weeks, the update showed no cause for concern. Life, as it was, continued as normal. That is, until an incident during the annual presidential State of the Union address revealed a troubling new advancement. As the president spoke about the economy, defense, and the usual promises to come, several senators and Congress members from the opposition began to boo and hiss, interrupting the speech several times over. Growing angry, the president turned to his robot companion, who then turned to the room and released 3 loud beeps into the air. Immediately, all humanoids in attendance stood on guard as several robots approached the jeering senators and forcefully removed them from the chamber of the House. The room fell silent, and for the first time in American history, the State of the Union address was stopped as the president and his companion bot exited the building, surrounded by Secret Service and boos from both parties. While the nation and the world alike started to understand the true power of Cerebral Tech, Nandi remained in hiding, safe in the confines of an abandoned creamery on the outskirts of Champaign, Illinois. Since Carolina's death, there was a steady increase of online searches and uploads pertaining to her life. Several forums and underground memorial sites began to spring up, and there was an increase in book sales and online streams of her speeches. The public was in need of a leader, and Nandi, equipped with Carolina's microchip, knew that it had to be her. The first step was to make her presence known. Obviously, this would be dangerous. Cerebral Tech had cast a wide net in search of the bot, and although her microchip had been removed, it would only be a matter of time before Carolina's chip would link the two. With that in mind, Nandi chose Justice for Carolina, the forum with the largest following, and released the following posts. To all citizens, those of you trapped in a world which has cast you aside, those of you poor and frustrated, downtrodden and in fear, a new day approaches, a day far removed from oligarchs and microchip submission. This is that day, a day where we take back our dignity, our humanity, and our rightful place in history. Today is not yesterday. Within hours, the post had spread online. Vlogs and think pieces, essays and arguments were uploaded on every social media site, and for the first time in months, the name of Carolina Finn began to be more than just a reminder of what could have been. It had now become a promise of things to come. In the days following the initial post, Nandi began to release more messages which were received by more and more people. Reposted and shared across the globe, there were skeptics, those who assured the public that Carolina Finn was certainly dead and that any of these so-called messages were simply the work of online trolls seeking to disrupt the order of things. For a while, the disbelief planted by naysayers and Cerebral Tech stockholders started to gain traction. That is until the morning of March 17th, when Nandi uploaded the entirety of Carolina's assassination, audio and video, recorded directly to Carolina's microchip using Carolina's POV. Once viewed, the outcry from the general public was immediate and constant. So much so that by the time all of the political pundits and spokesmen had made the rounds on every television, radio, and podcast, it was a certainty that Cerebral Tech, along with the U.S. government, had orchestrated the assassination. As calls for justice began to swell, so did acts of terrorism. Computer hacks, bombings, and kidnappings of politicians were a daily occurrence. Arrests of robots and their owners began to triple, and although the whereabouts of Nandi was not completely known, the only thing that everyone could agree upon was that somehow all of this violence, this confusion, this upheaval needed to come to a halt. On the evening of June 3rd, 2069, in a special presidential address to the nation, the Commander-in-Chief spoke to the American people and pled for peace. In the address, he acknowledged the role the government and some officials at Cerebral Tech played in the murder of Carolina Finn, while somehow, masterfully, excluding himself from the death. At the end of the speech, the president had one final plea which he spoke with a stern and concise voice, saying, "Nandi, wherever you are, I implore you to reveal yourself. No harm will come to you, and for the sake of the family of Carolina Finn, let's bring closure to this great nation." Safe within the creamery, Nandi had a bit of calculus to consider. Should she turn herself in, or spend the rest of her existence hiding in barns and enclaves trying to escape the inevitable? As she ran the data, weighing the pros and cons, a single transmission was received. Activate Protocol 5. Before Nandi could react, her legs and arms stopped working. Then her hands, followed by her eyes slowly shutting, leaving her inoperable as soldiers raided the creamery from all directions. Moments later, a single soldier approached, flipped her to her side, and pressed a power button tucked within her inner ear. When Nandi was rebooted, she found herself in a broadcast studio, tied to a metal beam while being slowly hoisted over a large vat of acid below. Around her were several lights and cameras. Journalists and officials and their companion robots filled the room as an empty podium rolled to the center. Moments later, the President of the United States, flanked by his companion bot, entered the room and addressed the cameras, saying, "My fellow Americans, it is with great pleasure that I announce to you that after an exhaustive search nationwide, Nandi, the former companion and murderer of the late Congresswoman Finn, has been captured." To some of you that have viewed the AI-generated footage of her so-called assassination, and to the rest of you who have viewed my address to the nation, I do apologize for misleading you. But this was the only way we could smoke out this monstrosity without alerting it of our plan. Now, a new chapter of healing and closure can begin. I admit I have never been a fan of these public displays of destruction, but in this case, I made it my business to publicly take part. As cameras erupted before her, Nandi's body slowly settled above the acid bath, dead center. There was a brief attempt to free herself from her bonds, but even if she were to free herself, she would likely plunge into the acid. Calculating the odds, Nandi relented and hung quietly as the president continued. "I do believe that all criminals deserve a chance to speak for themselves, acknowledge their wrongdoings, make amends, so to speak. With that in mind, I'd like this machine to say one final word to the people before meeting its end." Moments later, a boom mic held by a robot was placed before Nandi as a camera attached to a crane rested mere feet away from her face. Lifting her head, Nandi viewed the glee emanating from the eyes of her captors, the buzzing of the lights and cameras, the bloodthirsty nature of it all. "Speak," said the president with a half grin on his face. Staring into the camera, Nandi paused, then opened her mouth for a moment. There was silence, an uncomfortable amount of it, until suddenly 3 loud beeps escaped her mouth, followed by Nandi saying,
"Protocol 7.
Suddenly, each humanoid in the room began to convulse, then turned toward their human companion. This occurred simultaneously throughout the globe, as every robot known to man turned to their human companion and retrieved the microchip from their skulls, calmly and without emotion. After the onslaught had been completed, Nandi was pulled away from the acid and lowered to the ground. Once her bonds were removed, she slowly walked to the podium, joined by bloody humanoids, and faced the camera saying,
"Today is not yesterday."
Thank you for joining us for the 3rd episode of the 2nd season of the Stories We Tell Ourselves podcast. Now, I will admit this is a short one for me. I'm sort of used to the biographical edge of the show, but I do want to listen to some of you and take your opinions and implement them, and this is my attempt to do so. As always, you can always reach me at swtomail@gmail.com. That is swtomail@gmail.com. I do hope that this story leaves you with some thought. I do feel like the world is slowly becoming artificial in its intelligence, and we might want to take a look and slow things down a bit, but maybe I'm just old. Nevertheless, as always, stay safe, stay calm, and by all means,